Chapter 65. On arriving at Nettlewood, they found the station in a busy state, with ringing telephones going unanswered and constables conferring with each other. A haze of cigarette smoke filled the room, with a low-hanging cloud that made it seem bigger than it was. A figure briskly approached them through the smog. "Inspector, good to see you." Frank held out his hand and the inspector shook it. "Morning, Drew." "Morning, Sarge," Drew nodded. "Sergeant, any leads regarding the missing men of Firestone?" the inspector asked. No," Frank replied forlornly. The inspector nodded as if this was unsurprising. He checked his watch. "I'm expecting some company at 10:30. I was hoping there might be time for a cup of tea before they arrive," the inspector asked hopefully. "Of course. Go and make yourselves comfortable in my office. I'll get the kettle on and then you can fill me in on what you've been up to. I'll be down shortly." Frank made his way towards the kitchen at the back of the station, while the inspector followed Drew down the corridor to the sergeant's office. The door was open, and the two men entered and sat down, the extra seat still positioned where the inspector had left it. Presently, Sergeant Gates came into the room carrying a tray of mugs and a pot of tea. He placed it on a desk and began to pour. "So, Inspector, are we any closer to discovering anything about the man Drew found in the woods?" Steam filled the air as he filled the mugs. "Well, we know he's from Swindon. A colleague of mine is there looking into his past, investigating his family and so forth." "Will we be having someone along to identify the body?" Frank asked. The inspector accepted a mug and sipped at the piping hot liquid before continuing. "I don't think that would be happening. I predict my colleague's search of Swindon will not be successful, and that no one will come forward to claim the body." "I see. So, are your investigations over?" The inspector smiled and Frank began to backtrack. "Sorry, I didn't mean I wanted rid of you. Of course, no offence taken, I assure you. I am as eager to wrap up the case as you are for the two towns to return to normality. However, there is still the matter of how the body arrived in the trees, and the case of the missing Banks, and of the mayor. I believe the disappearances are related to the body's appearance. I am also led to believe that as the two men were together on the night of the body's appearance, that there is a link between them, and all the other people at the mayor's house last Sunday night, to the body. What that connection is, I am still trying to determine." He paused to sip his tea. "It would appear, however, that the body Drew found is not the first to have appeared in the woods. We may know who the victim is and where he is from, but we still know nothing of why or how he appeared where he did. That is why I am still here, and why I have requested some extra help in finding out." "Extra help?" Frank asked. "Yes. Once I've set them to work, Drew and I will revisit the other members of the mayor's party and question them further." Drew and Frank shared a confused glance. "That reminds me, may I ask for some of your men to follow the mayor's guests to ensure we don't lose track of them as we have Banks and the mayor?" The inspector asked so politely it hardly sounded like a command at all. "Well, I'll have to see who we have available." Frank stood and walked over to the door. "Carl, can you bring in this week's rota?" There was a reply inaudible to Drew and the inspector, but Frank seemed satisfied. He returned to his seat. "So do you have any theories as to what links Banks to the body?" Frank was unable to hide his interest in Banks' involvement. "I've been investigating Banks over the last few days. He has been avoiding me ever since I questioned him, no doubt realising that I was going to discover something he would rather remain hidden. Drew has been delving into his father's past, and more about his involvement with the body has become clear." The inspector paused for a moment. "You'll have to excuse me if I'm a little vague with details, Sergeant. The trouble is that my investigations often need to remain a closely guarded secret, and the fewer people that are aware of them, the better chance there is of the secret remaining a secret, and my investigations remaining uncompromised. From what I have discovered, you are right to harbour your suspicions of Banks. Our priority now becomes finding him, ensuring he is safe, and bringing him to justice for his actions over the last 30 or so years." Sergeant Gates physically sighed. "So you believe Banks was involved in my brother's death?" he asked, gratified. "I believe your brother was on the same trail that I have discovered, and Banks stopped him before he discovered too much. Banks attempted to stop me, but fortunately I was able to thwart him before he was successful." Drew and Frank looked shocked. "He tried to kill you?" Frank could barely believe what he was hearing. "Yes, he did. It was immediately after this attempt that he vanished." Frank and Drew tried to digest the situation. "There's something else I wanted to show you." He reached into his case and retrieved the letter Drew had discovered. He passed it to Frank, who read it studiously. "Okay." He looked up at the two men sat opposite him. "Who is KB?" "We were hoping you might know," Drew replied for them. "Well, whoever it was, it looked like your dad was trying to tell them about Banks," Frank told Drew, and fell into a thought for a moment. A knock at the door interrupted him. "Here's the rota you asked for, Sarge." The man passed a piece of paper to him. "You all right?" Yes, thanks, Carl." He regained his composure and tried to study the rota. Carl left them to it, but before he had left the room, another constable knocked on the door. "Court, it's like Piccadilly bloody circus in here today," Frank swore. "Sorry, Sarge, there's a bloke here asking for you. Well, actually, he asked for the inspector." "Morning, sir. Drew." He nodded respectfully to both men. "Ah, it would appear the cavalry has arrived." The inspector downed the last of his cooling tea and stood up. "Gentlemen, we must be off." The inspector waited for them both to put their coats and hats on. Then they made their way back through the station to the public waiting room. Standing at ease and reading the notices on the board was a man in the mossy green camouflage of an army uniform. He wore a green beret, and on hearing the door open he turned to face the three men. "Inspector?" he asked, the one man not in police uniform. "Yes, Major Shepherd." "That's right, sir. Before we continue, do you mind if I see some identification?" "Protocol," he explained curtly. "I understand. I commend you for your keenness to detail." The inspector removed his wallet and took from it some papers which he showed the Major. He studied them carefully. "Very good, sir, thanking you." He handed them back to the inspector, who placed them carefully in his wallet. The Major seemed amiable enough, though serious and businesslike. He had a row of different coloured ribbons over his right breast, and crowns sewn into the shoulder tags of his uniform. "Of course. Thank you for coming to my aid at such short notice," he replied with a grateful smile. "The barracks isn't far, and it's always good to get the lads out on some exercises." Frank and Drew exchanged more confused glances. "There are more of you?" Frank asked, somewhat surprised. "Indeed, Sergeant. I have a bus full of my finest outside, awaiting the inspector's orders," the Major informed the shocked policeman. "Well, let's have a look at them, shall we?" the inspector suggested, and led the way with the three men following closely behind. Chapter 66. Parked by the curb outside the station stood a stout blue bus being battered by a fresh shower of icy rain. The engine ticked over, filling the air with a noisy clicking and the smell of diesel. The four men entered the bus and climbed the steps up to where the occupants sat waiting. Sat on the bus were 30 chattering young men in uniforms identical to their commanding officers, save for the crown on the shoulder and the row of ribbons on the breast. Frank and Drew were completely taken aback. At the appearance of Major Shepherd and the others, the men quietened down and turned their attention to the front of the bus. "Settle down, lads," Major Shepherd called to them, and soon the bus was a dead calm. "This is the inspector we were told about," he announced. "For the time being, he will be giving the orders through me. We do as he says quickly and as safely as we can, and we can all get back to the barracks and running around the parade ground in the cold and wet." The captain was commanding, yet respected enough by his men to joke with them, and a small ripple of titters echoed between them. "As it is, I don't think he's got anything nice planned for you, but I'm sure you'll make the most of it. Inspector?" He offered him the floor. The inspector stepped forward. "Good morning, gentlemen. I am indeed the inspector from Scotland Yard, as the good Major pointed out. I am also giving the orders, as the Major rightly pointed out. The task at hand is not a pleasant one. We will mostly be digging." The men shifted about in their seats, but kept their thought on the subject to themselves. Frank frowned in confusion. He had presumed they were there to search the copse for the missing men. "There is a good chance, while we are digging, that we will find human remains in various states of decay. What else, other than that, we might find, I have no idea. However, it is imperative that whatever you discover does not get shared with anyone outside of this regiment. Before we make our way to our destination, I must ask that you all sign this." He reached inside his briefcase and brought out a document Drew recognised. It was passed around with a pen, and the men all began adding their signatures to it. "This is a document, a lot like the National Secrets Act, which you are signing to show you agree not to tell anyone," the inspector informed them simply. He had faith in them and their abilities. He knew, as they did, that this was part of the protocol for these situations. The inspector kept speaking as the men passed it round, adding their individual signatures. "We will also be chopping. We need to clear a path through trees big enough for the mechanical diggers that are arriving tomorrow morning to help us dig. I'm informed that there are some here licensed to drive them?" he asked the attentive faces. "Yes, sir." A few of the men spoke up with raised hands. "Splendid. Before you begin using the diggers tomorrow, we will assess the situation and see what you need to dig." The wad of paper with everyone's signature reached the front, and the driver, Captain Shepherd, and Sergeant Gates all signed it too. "Wonderful. Drew, if you could please follow us in your car. Sergeant Gates, I'll be back just after lunch. Please could you contact the hospital and arrange for Andy and Jim to meet us here at 1 with Casey and one of your police vans?" the inspector asked. "Yes, of course," Frank nodded. "Who's Casey?" he asked, fishing out his notebook and beginning to write it all down. "Call Dr. Collins in the morgue. He'll be able to sort it all out for you," Drew told him. Frank kept nodding and made some scribbles. "Well then, shall we?" the inspector suggested. Drew and Frank disembarked, and the driver closed the folding door behind them. They stood and watched the bus drive away towards Firestone. "Digging?" Frank whispered to Drew on the roadside as they watched the bus vanish round the corner. "How much digging is he expecting to do with that lot? And some diggers?" "Quite a bit by the looks of it," Drew replied, equally as mystified. "Do you know what he's going on about?" Frank asked, still unable to fathom the situation. "No, but it's not even lunchtime, and I have already had a very strange day. Something tells me it's going to keep getting stranger," Drew told him. He hurried over to his car. "See you later, Frank." "Yes, Drew, see you later. Take it easy out there, okay?" Frank called as Drew ducked into his car. Chapter 67. The inspector and Major Shepherd took a seat behind the driver, and the inspector called out the occasional direction for him. "Head left out of here and follow the road until I say turn right." "Yes, sir," the man replied. The bus trundled out of Nettlewood and through the fields, and after a few minutes the men on the bus began chattering quietly amongst themselves again, discussing their objective and what they might find. Before long they were entering the trees around Firestone. Right up here, then pull up on the left-hand side just past the church, the inspector called as they approached the Firestone roundabout. Yes, sir, the man replied simply again. They were soon past the church, and as instructed, the driver pulled into the side of the road, hazard lights flashing orange against the trunks. We're here, the inspector stood and informed the bus passengers. When we get off the bus, please can we split into 2 teams depending on what side of the bus you're on. If you're on this side of the bus, I will leave you in the hands of Major Shepherd. He indicated the right-hand side of the bus. Please can you begin clearing the trees where I enter them, and keep clearing them until you find me again. If you are on this side of the bus, you are with me. We will fight our way through to the copse, and I will show you where I need you to begin digging. The inspector looked about at the young faces. They looked back expectantly. Any questions? No, sir, came a resounding reply. Very well, shall we get started? The inspector asked rhetorically, and climbed down the stairs. The men were very quick at retrieving their equipment from the side compartments of the bus. The panels were quickly opened and the equipment dished out. Drew pulled up behind the bus and switched his blue flashing lights on to warn oncoming traffic of the obstruction, then walked over to join the inspector. Ah, Drew, splendid, we're just organising ourselves. The men were lined up in their 2 groups with equipment in hand within 10 minutes. Drew watched mesmerised by the men's energy and organisation while the inspector opened Drew's boot and put his Wellingtons on. Right, lads, this way, the inspector called when he was sure they were all together. Drew, stay close to me. Yes, Inspector, Drew replied, rather awed by his casual authority over the regiment. They marched up to the trees, and for a moment the inspector was lost as he searched by the side of the road for the markers he had left. Ah, here we are, he exclaimed suddenly. OK, diggers, all together please, here we go. The inspector headed in through the trees, the 15 soldiers and the policeman close behind. As he fought his way through the undergrowth, he heard Captain Shepherd beginning to bark orders at the remaining 15 soldiers, and soon the sound of chainsaws began echoing through the trees. The men tripped their way haphazardly through the trees after the inspector, making a decent path for their colleagues to follow. Soon the mound loomed through the branches at them, surprising the party, including the inspector, who had been looking out for it. The men all filed out of the trees and sized up their task. Drew approached the inspector, who was fishing in his bag for something. Drew's jaw dropped when he laid eyes upon the mountain of mud. "How did you find this?" he asked, rather mystified. "What do you think it is?" "I found it whilst on the walk I took last night," he replied casually. Drew thought for a moment, and tried to fathom how he might have found this place alone in the dark. "As I said, I got a little distracted," the inspector explained, though this still didn't satisfy the policeman. The inspector removed his electromagnetically sensitive device from his bag and switched it on while the men prepared themselves. "As to what it is, I'm hoping that's what these chaps will be able to discover." The needle on the machine immediately shot up, and it started to emit a high-pitched squeal into the air. The inspector raised an eyebrow and quickly turned it off again. He replaced it in his bag and cleared his throat. "Right, gentlemen," he spoke up so they could all hear him clearly. "I want to find out what is in here." "We are really a scouting mission, a reconnaissance. Our task is to gauge just how hard a job it is going to be to clear this mud. There are a few spaces in the trees about us we can use to fill with the mud we will remove. Please begin as soon as you are ready," he asked them politely, and they all began to spread out along the face of the mound, tenderly prodding the soil with their spades and pickaxes, summing up their options. They began talking amongst themselves to decide on a tactic to tackle the mountain. Drew and the inspector looked on anxiously, the inspector taking the occasional picture of the men, the mound, and the trees. One of the soldiers prodded the mound tenderly, causing some of the soil to shift, which gave way to a small avalanche of mud from the top. A few men leapt out of his way, but no one was hurt, and the task had begun. They dug their spades into the fallen soil and began to shift it into the trees. "Splendid," the inspector called excitedly. Soon a chain of men had formed, slowly transporting the mud from the continuing avalanches into the trees. The men shifted spadeful after spadeful away under the inspector's watchful eye. Drew looked about the trees, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched, dissected and scrutinised by some unseen object dwelling within. The copse was not used to having people amongst the trunks, and now the group of men digging and chopping were disturbing something in the trees. "Drew," the inspector called to him, disturbing his reverie. "Yes, Inspector," Drew called back, his attention drawn back to the mound. The inspector stalked through the trees and joined the constable where he stood looking into the copse. He noticed his attention was drawn to the trees. "What is it?" the inspector asked him. "Nothing, just thinking how long it has been since anyone has been here. I don't think the trees like it," Drew replied. "They have become accustomed to not changing, of standing undisturbed. It must seem strange for so many people to be walking amongst them and invading their space," the inspector mused. "Yes, it is," Drew replied, feeling the strangeness himself. Well, for now, I think we may need some help from Firestone Constabulary. Would you be kind enough to head into town to see if you can find any of your colleagues? I think our arboreal exercises could attract some attention from the villagers, and it would be good to have some uniform present to distract them and allay any fears. Of course, leave it to me, Drew agreed, with some hesitation. He was hoping to see what the men might reveal, but accepted his orders obediently and headed back out of the trees to his squad car. Chapter 68. Drew returned an hour later, having finally located 2 officers from Firestone. They had followed him to the site in their squad car. Once both cars were safely parked, he approached the 2 men, who surveyed the situation suspiciously. "What's all this about then, Drew?" Constable Hanson asked, rather surprised at all the commotion. He was in his 40s, greying, and pleased to be able to help the man from London. "All part of the investigation into the body I found on Sunday," Drew replied vaguely. He hadn't much of an idea himself what it was all about. "All you chaps need to do is stop anyone trying to get into the trees to poke about, and stop them disturbing the men from the barracks," he explained. The 2 constables goggled at the sight of the men working in the trees. They had already cleared a large space, opening up an area large enough to move the bus off the road. "The inspector is overseeing the whole thing. I'm sure he'll be able to explain it all to you soon." The 2 men shook their heads in wonder at the operation. Drew left them by the side of the road and walked towards the noise of the chainsaws. The men had split into several teams. While some chainsawed their way through the trunks, others attacked the stumps that they left behind with pickaxes and ropes. More still carted the debris away and had started a stack of fallen trunks at one side of the clearing they had created. A wide, uneven path was gradually forming through the trees, which were powerless under the might of the men and their machines. Drew spotted Major Shepherd as he picked his way carefully along the path, and the 2 men nodded respectfully at each other as he passed. He eventually reached the inspector and found that after an hour of hard work the mound had lost no discernible height, despite there being mounds of mud throughout the trees around them. The regiment were beginning to lose momentum at the unthankful task, and the ground beneath their feet was becoming clogged with fallen earth. It was as if the copse was fighting back at the change, not allowing the men to alter years of stasis. It had become stuck rigidly in its undisturbed undergrowth, and it stubbornly refused to change. "Ah, Drew, you're back. You were successful, I presume?" the inspector asked hopefully as Drew approached the trampled mud. "Yes, Inspector. 2 constables are stationed by the road to put the fears of any passing pedestrians at ease." "Splendid," he replied, pleased with Drew's luck. "How have things been here?" "It looks as though you've been working hard, but I can't see much of a change to the mound," Drew pointed out. "Quite," the inspector agreed. Knowing he was beaten, he made a decision. "Thank you, gentlemen. If you want to stop there," he called. With an audible sigh of relief, the men stopped what they were doing and made their way to where the inspector stood. "It is clear to me, as I'm sure it is to you, that for all your hard work we did not seem to be making much progress." A low murmur of agreement echoed between them. "So I think we should wait until the digger arrives tomorrow before we continue. For now, I suggest we adjourn to the Green Man, where I've arranged for you to all get a good feed." The men's spirits immediately brightened at the thought of a trip to the pub. "Let's head back to your colleagues in Superior and see what progress they have made, then jump on the bus and head into town," the inspector informed the happy men. They headed into the trees towards the sound of the chainsaws that had been gradually approaching as the morning had gone on. On their arrival, the inspector studied the progress with glee. "Oh, I am pleased you have made such headway, Major," the inspector informed them. "These are good lads, these," the Major replied with a hint of pride in his voice. "Indeed they are. We didn't have much luck clearing the soil, I'm afraid. Shall we break for lunch? I've arranged for some refreshments at a local pub, if you think that would suffice," the inspector asked. "I think you'd be very popular with the lads. I'll let you tell them," the Major replied. The inspector nodded. "Thank you, gentlemen. You can all break there," the inspector called to them with a smile. The sound of chopping gradually ceased, and the 2 teams began swapping tales of their hard work. "Thank you. You have all worked spectacularly hard this morning, and to show my gratitude, I would like to take you all into town for a pint and some sandwiches." A barely suppressed cheer echoed around the trees. "So if we can all jump back on the bus, and we'll get you down there." The men didn't need much convincing, and all piled onto their transport. As they did, the 2 constables approached. "Does that include us, then?" Constable Hanson asked. "Ah, good afternoon, gentlemen," the inspector welcomed them jovially. "Unfortunately, you will need to remain here to ensure we don't have any trespassers disturbing any evidence or tampering with the equipment. We should be back in an hour or so. Perhaps you could contact Firestone Station and see if any of your colleagues are available to come and relieve you later." "And what are we to tell anyone that should ask what is going on?" the constable asked. "The truth, or at least a watered-down version of it. This is all part of the investigation into the body that was discovered Sunday night, and that this area of the copse is temporarily out of bounds while we search for evidence." "Have you found another body?" Hanson's colleague, Constable Presley, asked. "Not yet, but that's not what we are looking for. No need to give too many details away, Constable. Simply inform them that these activities are part of our ongoing investigation. Is that clear?" the inspector asked. The 2 men were making it fairly clear that they would rather be coming to the Green Man with the soldiers. "Yes, Inspector," they replied grudgingly. "Splendid," the inspector replied. "See you later," and he climbed onto the bus. The driver made short work of the drive to the pub, his pace no doubt encouraged by the thought of a free beer and lunch. When the men arrived at the Green Man, the few locals that had come out for a beverage that afternoon sat open-mouthed at the seemingly never-ending line of soldiers that traipsed in and made their way directly to the bar. Lionel stood rubbing his hands together eagerly. On hearing the commotion of 30 men filling the space, Mavis came rushing out of the kitchen to greet them. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she called over the din. "Oh, hello, Mavis. Please put anything the men order onto my tab," he called back. "Will do. Your lunch is all set up in the lounge bar. Make your way through when you're ready. Thank you so much." The men all slowly made their way from the bar to the lounge carrying foaming pints of beer. Good to her word, Mavis had put together a generous spread, and they tucked in eagerly. The food was soon devoured, and the men made themselves comfortable in the warm surroundings while they digested the food. It wasn't long before Mavis appeared and began clearing away plates and glasses. "Oh dear," she said to the inspector, "I fear I might not have done enough if they've eaten it all." "Oh, fear not, Mavis, I'm sure you've done yourself proud," he replied to put her mind at ease. She nodded respectfully, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "We will be leaving shortly. Could I possibly have 2 flasks of tea to take with me? I will of course return them later." "I should think that could be arranged," she agreed with a nod, and hustled away to search for a couple of flasks. The inspector glanced about the room and noticed that the men had all finished eating and drinking, so he addressed them again. "If I could have your attention for a moment, please," he called above their din. With little effect, Major Shepherd noticed and called sternly, "That's enough, lads. Quieten down." This had the desired effect, and their voices were quickly silenced. "Thank you, Major. Now, I hope you are all refreshed and ready for an afternoon of work. If we could all file out and back to the bus, please. When we return to the copse, please split back into your 2 groups you were in earlier." "Yes, sir," came the hearty reply, and the men filed out of the pub obediently with the Major, the Inspector, and the Constable following close behind. "Inspector," Mavis called as they passed through the bar, "don't forget your flasks." "Thank you, Mavis. I'm sure you've just made 2 bored bobbies very happy." She smiled, though she wasn't at all sure what he meant. "Good day. I shall be home in time for supper." He raised his hat to her and made his way unhurriedly after the others. The shocked occupants of the bar began swapping stories and rumours about what the men might be doing, and some followed the men out to try and fathom where they might be going. Chapter 69. At the copse, the bus pulled up into the pothole-covered area of trees that the men had cleared, and they began to disembark. Once out, they began filing into their 2 teams again, while the inspector approached the 2 policemen in the car. They saw him coming, and Constable Presley, who was sat in the driver's seat, wound down his window. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Here, I thought you might appreciate some tea." He passed them the flask, and they accepted gratefully. "There's a couple of constables from Nettlewood coming to relieve us in an hour," Handsome informed the inspector. "Perfect. We'll keep going while we still have the light," he informed them. "Perhaps you could arrange a rota with your colleagues at Nettlewood. I need someone back here first thing. Looks like we could be here for a few days. Lots of work to do." They nodded back, glad to be part of the investigation. The inspector left them to their tea and went back over to the men who were lined up and waiting orders. "Gentlemen, thank you so much for arranging yourselves so quickly." The men fell silent and all turned to listen. The cold drizzle that had begun to cover them was a far cry from the cosy warmth they had left behind in the pub. "I think a swapping of tasks might be in order," he informed them. "Could the men who accompanied me into the copse earlier please assist Major Shepherd with the task of clearing the trees, and the men that were clearing the trees please follow me. We're going to pay a visit to a friend of mine across the road." Drew raised an eyebrow and wondered who he meant. "Drew, would you care to come along?" the inspector asked. "Of course, Inspector. Where are we going?" "To the vicarage. It's not far," he replied. "We will return later, Major," he informed him. "Yes, Inspector, no problem," the Major replied, beginning to wonder himself about the inspector and what it was they were all doing out here in the cold and wet. Satisfied, the inspector stomped off in his Wellingtons down the road towards the vicar's house. Drew followed obediently. The soldiers formed a line behind them, and they all marched down the road. "So, the vicarage?" Drew asked, rather confused as they walked. "What are we doing there?" "There is a large section of the graveyard hidden in the copse," the inspector informed him as they walked. "I'd like to clear it for a better look." Drew frowned. "And you discovered this, I presume, whilst on your walk last night?" Drew asked. "I did," the inspector informed him casually. "There's not enough space in the trees up there for all these men just yet, so we'll put them to some good use somewhere else while we wait for the area to clear a little." Drew didn't take the inspector's choice of route for his evening stroll any further. If he wanted him to know, he reasoned, he would know already. They arrived at the small cottage of the vicarage, and the inspector announced their arrival with a short series of raps at the door. It was presently opened, and Aldous' face lit up at the sight of his visitor. "Inspector!" he exclaimed, his smiling face quickly turning to surprise at the sight of the men behind him. "What are all these chaps here for?" "Good afternoon, Aldous. These are men from the local barracks. They are here to assist us with revealing what secrets the graveyard might hold." Aldous glanced over the inspector's shoulder. "Oh my, such a lot of them," he gasped, rather impressed. "You remember Constable Gates?" the inspector introduced Drew formally. "Yes, good afternoon, Constable." Aldous smiled to him and Drew nodded back. Not quite sure how or when the vicar and the inspector had become so informal with each other. The vicar's behaviour was far removed from what he had seen Monday morning. He was much more relaxed in the policeman's company. "Give me a moment, I'll put my boots on and walk you round." He began putting his boots and coat on, and Drew turned to the inspector once more. "He seems pleased to see you," Drew noted. The inspector nodded, but did not give any more of an explanation. Soon enough, Aldous was leading them around the side of the cottage's flint walls. The thorny rose bush climbing up one side of the cottage did nothing to allude to the beauty it would exude in the spring. The path was bordered by empty flower beds. The garden sat in stasis as it awaited the spring. At the back of the property they were faced with the slowly disappearing gravestones and the encroaching copse. They all filed into the space between the house and the trees, standing amongst the stones. "Well, gentlemen," the inspector faced the men, "hidden amongst these trees is the rest of the graveyard. It extends approximately 30 yards into the copse, where a small stone wall stands. While we wait for your colleagues to clear a path through the trees to the mound, we will be helping the vicar to clear his graveyard. We have hidden in the trees hundreds of years of Firestone's history, and we need to clear it as carefully as we can. Any questions?" "No, sir," came the resounding reply. The orders were painfully simple. "Wonderful. I will leave Drew here with you to field any issues you might come across. I will be stepping inside with the vicar for a few moments." Drew did his best to hide his continually deepening confusion, and as the men began readying themselves for an afternoon of hacking and sawing at the trees, Aldous led the inspector inside. "Well, I am pleased to see you in one piece. How did it go last night?" Aldous asked the moment the door was closed behind them. He wasted no time in asking questions, or putting the kettle on. "Not well," the inspector replied, as positively as he could. "Banks tried to kill me and then disappeared into the copse." The vicar looked up from the sink where the kettle was slowly filling with water. "Banks tried to kill you?" he asked in shocked awe. "Why?" "Because it would appear that I am getting close to whatever it is that he and his family have been hiding for the last 100 years or more. Now he has disappeared, and I'm afraid I may never get the opportunity to question him." "Well, shouldn't you be out looking for him?" the vicar asked. "Oh, rest assured, we have men searching across the county for him. Some are searching the copse, some are conducting a door-to-door search. I don't think they will have any luck, but we'll see." The inspector was removing paperwork from his briefcase and arranging it on the table. The vicar soon joined him with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "So, I suppose this is the document you wanted me to sign?" he asked, picking the bundle of papers up and examining it anxiously. "My word, it certainly seems very thorough." He fished out some fragile-looking reading glasses from his shirt pocket and began reading, but gave up after a few sentences. "Perhaps you could give me the drift of what it is that I'm signing?" he asked. "Of course. It is rather a daunting document," the inspector conceded. "Essentially you are saying that you agree not to speak to anyone regarding the information you have about the case. What you know can never be shared. As we agreed on Tuesday morning?" "Yes, exactly, as we agreed on Tuesday morning. This just makes it official." "Well, I have no issue with signing that." Aldous skipped to the last page and slowly scrawled his signature across the line. "There." He passed it back to the inspector. "Now, how did you get so many men so quickly?" the vicar asked. "Oh, well, such is the need to get the case wrapped up as quickly as possible. The department I work for has far-reaching powers," the inspector informed him cryptically. "I see," Aldous replied, not sure if he really did understand. "What department is it you work for exactly? I'm not sure if you ever told me." "I work for the Department of External Affairs," the inspector informed him purposefully. Aldous frowned. "That sounds sufficiently vague," he complained. The inspector smiled. "Usually the vagueness and the authority end the questioning there," the inspector admitted. "The department is there to look into things that other departments don't want to know about. Affairs that are external to other government departments, that are external to the generally accepted world view. Things that don't fit into God's plan," Aldous commented, referring to their earlier conversation. "If there is a plan, your God has gone to great lengths to conceal it," the inspector informed him kindly. Aldous smiled knowingly. He could sense the difference of opinion and didn't want to test their blossoming friendship. "I was hoping I might pop up to your spare room. I have a feeling I may have left something behind," the inspector asked airily. "Please, help yourself, though I did check and I couldn't see anything, apart from the camera and the rolls of film," he remembered, opening a drawer and handing the film to him. Aldous was glad of the change of subject. "Thank you, but I will just have a double check." The inspector left the film on the table and ascended the stairs quickly. He opened the spare room door and saw that since his departure Aldous had somehow made the room look even tidier than when he had left it. He retrieved the reports from under the carpet where he had left them and returned to the vicar's kitchen. "Ah, I see you found it," Aldous remarked, rather surprised at the papers in his hand. "I'm sure I would have noticed something like that." His eyes thinned a little in realisation that the inspector must have hid them from him. "Yes, thank you." He opened the case and concealed the papers and film inside. He faced Aldous with a smile. "Now, there was just a matter of reimbursing you for the food and the cleaning of my clothes." "Oh, really, Inspector, I assure you there is no need. I was pleased for the company, and to have little excitement added to my otherwise quiet existence." Aldous began a fluster of hands in objection, which the Inspector ignored. "I appreciate that, but still, Her Majesty's police force insists." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and produced a pre-written cheque which he passed to the vicar. Aldous studied it, and the sum made his eyes widen. "My, this is too generous," he shook his head, unable to tear his eyes from the amount he had given. "Oh, please, you are a perfect host in an imperfect situation. This is to show how grateful the Yard is for your cooperation." The vicar blushed slightly. "Well, if it was coming from your own pocket, I might have put up more of a fight, but if you insist, how can I turn down such generosity?" Aldous' mind turned for a moment to the leaking roof in the small chapel next door. He stood and put the cheque safely away in a drawer.